Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing a review of Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. This is a book that I've been hearing mentioned quite a bit recently. I think the first time I heard about it was on Elliot Brooks's channel. She mentioned it, I think it was as part of some planning TBR videos she was doing, but she mentioned it as an underrated fantasy book that she had never heard that anyone who had read it hadn't liked it. And a little while after that, Alan at the Library of Alexandria really started raving about this book and recommending it really highly. So it's been on my radar for a little while, and I actually had it on my TBR for August. Didn't really start it until the very end of August, but I finished it now and I really loved it. I've definitely been more in the mood for non-traditional fantasy recently, and this book totally fit the bill. This book was originally self-published and then got picked up by a traditional publisher, and actually knowing that really made me feel like I should be more open to reading self-published books. It hasn't really been something that's been on my radar in the past, but this book was really outstanding and really well written. And just knowing that something like this was self-published, and eventually it did get enough hype and attention that it was picked up by a traditional publisher. But there might be other self-published books out there that are also really good. And I've never felt like self-published books were inherently not good. It just seemed like a lot of effort to, be able to know what to try and what not to try. But I guess that's a really good thing about BookTube too. Maybe I don't have to do the hard work. I can just see if there are self-published books that other people are recommending and read those. Senlin Ascends is about Thomas Senlin, who's a headmaster from a small town. He's on his honeymoon with his new wife, Maria, and they are going to visit the Tower of Babel, which is a very famous place that he has read about for all of his life and has taught about in his school, but has never actually seen. And so this is supposed to be kind of the adventure of a lifetime for them. But unfortunately, basically, as soon as they arrive and before they even get to the tower, he gets separated from his wife, Maria. She disappears, and the rest of the book is basically about him having to enter the Tower of Babel and ascend in order to try to get her back. It's a bit hard to categorize this book. It has some steampunk elements. There are certain things that are clockwork or mechanical. There are some airships. It definitely maybe falls a little more into, I guess, what you could call gas lamp fantasy. It has a very Victorian feel overall. What really makes this book great is Senlin as a character. He's very different than the kind of character you would usually find in a fantasy novel, and I really, really liked him as soon as he's introduced in the first couple of pages of the book, and he is busy telling his wife all these facts while she is trying to enjoy the scenery and sort of take in the adventure that they're on. I completely felt like I knew who he was as a person, and it's a person that I have known and liked before and have a great deal of affection for. He is somebody who feels like he's the most educated and intelligent person that he knows, or, in his town. So he always feels like he knows best. He feels like he's a great judge of character because he's used to dealing with his students, and he's maybe not the greatest judge of character, actually. And it just takes a long time for him to accept what's happening and what he needs to do, but he also goes through a big character transformation in this book, but he doesn't become someone other than what he is. He just needs to learn and to grow. Senlin doesn't seem like the most likely source of romance, and even when his relationship with Maria gets introduced in the book, he is about 10 years older than her, and it is sort of described as a completely practical marriage where, for various reasons, they each felt like the other person was a good match. But then their story gets told in these flashbacks throughout the course of the book, and you come to realize that their relationship is actually much deeper and much more profound and much more romantic than maybe he is even able to acknowledge to himself. He's a character that doesn't seem to know how to be in a relationship. He doesn't know how to be a good partner. But there's also something in him that she obviously saw and appreciated and fell in love with. And I think we as readers also start to see that as he goes throughout this book. I got a very strong flavor of Charles Dickens, which ends up feeling like pretty high praise for a recently written fantasy book, but I do feel there are certain stylistic similarities. I feel like Josiah Bancroft's writing in this book does feel very classic. It's really beautifully written, and it does feel like it could have been written quite a long time ago. There are things about it that are more modern. It doesn't feel like any kind of pastiche or attempt to imitate old writing, but it does have a classic feel. But some of the things to me that really reminded me of Dickens are, first of all, Dickens always cataloged these kinds of social issues, human vice, and you really get a feeling for that and the way the Tower of Babel is described. It is not the wonderful place that Senlin thought it was going to be and read about in his guidebook and his books all these years. It really is a place where all sorts of human vice is on display, but the way that vice is sort of displayed, just the feeling of it felt very Dickens to me. Another thing that I found to be really Dickensian were the way Bancroft writes characters. You get these very larger-than-life, colorful, well-defined characters that show up just for a chapter or two, but you do get a sense of who they are and their characteristics very quickly, and they're definitely memorable characters that just stick with you. But just like in Dickens, because Dickens had sort of a similar thing, right? His characters always had colorful names, colorful personalities. They weren't necessarily caricatures. They just felt sort of, I don't even know how to describe that really. If you've read Dickens, you know there's something where you just felt you quintessentially got a sense of who that character was, and it had to do with their name and their description and their qualities, all just really coming together very quickly. And I feel like you got that in Senlin Ascends as well. But you also, I felt like because of that similarity, even though we were sort of seeing characters and then leaving them behind as Senlin goes on his journey, I definitely had this feeling that they would be coming back, and that is something that always happens in Dickens. You'll have this side character that shows up for a little while, and then they'll come back in some crucial role later on. So that's definitely something that's the case here too. I was a bit afraid at one point that we weren't going to get that, but it very much was a characteristic of this book. I hope this review isn't just turning into a giant list of comparisons, but I also felt a little bit reminded of The Little Prince when I read this, because you have a character that seems to come from a very mundane world who is then going on this adventure or having this experience where suddenly all these fantastical people or things are there, and it just is sort of on this boundary of what makes sense. In general, the world building was kind of interesting here because you start the story when Senlin and Maria, they are just arriving at the Tower of Babel, so you see what kind of world, you know what kind of world they must have come from. It's kind of described, it's this small village, pretty remote, and probably not that exciting, but you don't really get to see the outside world ever, so there's something kind of fantastical, almost trippy about the experiences at the Tower of Babel. It doesn't quite feel like a real place. You're kind of questioning what's real and what isn't, but you don't have anything to compare it to. So it just all feels kind of strange. Even though you're getting some flashbacks and references to the outside world, and there are other characters that came from outside the tower as well, it's just, I don't have the strongest sense of what that world is like. It is called the Kingdom of I'm wondering, is this some sort of alternate Mesopotamia? Is this a world where the Tower of Babel never fell? Or is it just completely an alternate thing that's also called the Tower of Babel? We kind of do have evoked this kind of ancient feeling from that world, but also it feels very British and buttoned up as well. So it's hard to know exactly what kind of a world this is. I enjoyed that sense of confusion and alternate reality, I guess, or that lack of reality. as Senlin starts to make more sense of his experiences, you do start feeling like the tower is the entire world. And that's how the people in the tower kind of seem to feel too, that the outside world almost doesn't matter or doesn't exist. So those are just my thoughts about the world. I'm curious to see how that ends up getting used or what it ends up feeling like in the later books. Sometimes there are things where I feel like the author is definitely going to do more world building or develop things more later on, and then it doesn't necessarily happen. So I don't know. As much as I enjoyed this book, I feel like how I feel about the series is just definitely going to depend on where it goes from here. One other comparison that I can't resist making is probably Dante, because you do have a character that is, well, instead of descending, he is ascending through literally things that are called ringdoms, because they're like these rings of the tower. Each level is kind of its own world or reality, and he is in pursuit of his love. And also you have each level sort of seeming to represent its own kind of vice or bad behavior. So it's not quite as simple as that. I don't even know if that's what the author had in mind, but I can't help thinking of it. One thing that I did really enjoy about the book is that you have at the beginning of each chapter these little epigraphs from Senlin's guidebook. It turns out that the guidebook is completely useless and probably was written by people that had never even been in the tower. So it has sort of these little hints of reality, but mostly completely unrelated to what's actually happening. But it's just funny seeing all this sort of very sage guidebook-like advice, very cheerfully presented with all this, bad stuff happening in the chapters. So I thought that was really funny. It definitely amused me. I think some people have compared that to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I haven't read that book in so long. I honestly can't really remember. But I did enjoy that aspect of the story. I do like when epigraphs are used for some effect beyond just info dumping us. In this case, I guess you would almost call them like an anti-info dump, because pretty much everything they're telling you is just not useful. This was a book that I really, really enjoyed. I think, like I mentioned, how I feel about it in the end will somewhat depend on how I feel about the rest of the series, but I'm very excited to keep reading this series. It's a very interesting kind of fantasy novel. It definitely satisfied my desire to read some more non-traditional fantasy, and I think it definitely is a book that people that don't normally enjoy fantasy might enjoy if they enjoy classic literature or, some of the other aspects of this book. I think the best thing about it really is Senlin as a character, who he is and how he grows and the journey he goes on. If you like only typical heroic actiony fantasy, this might not be something that you love, but I don't know. I feel like this could appeal to a lot of different readers, and I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts on it. So let me know if you have read this book or if you're planning to read it. Let me know your thoughts, and thanks for watching.